The planet Zyra was as unforgiving as it was remote. Its jagged cliffs, barren landscapes, and freezing winds made it the perfect place for those who wanted to disappear, or those who had no choice but to be forgotten. Beneath the twin moons, casting an eerie silver glow over the cold rock, lay Alira, a young Zevran girl who had once been full of life and promise. Now she was nothing more than an afterthought to her own people, a being they had deemed too weak to carry on, too frail to survive. They left her in this desolate place, believing that nature would do what they couldn't bring themselves to finish. Alira's once bright violet eyes were now dulled, half-lidded as she struggled to breathe. Every gasp sent waves of pain through her chest, and her limbs felt like lead. She could barely move, let alone call out for help. Even if she could scream, who would hear her? Her people had fled. The illness that ravaged her body was something the Zevrans had long feared. In their culture, weakness was akin to death itself. It was a stain on their proud race, a blemish they would rather forget than face. The wind howled around her, and the cold bit her exposed skin, her once luminescent silver-scaled body now dull and lifeless. Memories flickered in her mind, of her family, her friends, her people. There had been a time when she was cherished, a prodigy among her kind. Her intellect had made her stand out, and many believed she would have gone on to be one of their greatest scientists, an explorer who would lead their race into a new age of discovery. But all of that seemed like a lifetime ago. Alira could still remember the look in their eyes when they saw the first signs of her illness, the subtle way her scales lost their sheen, how she struggled to keep up with the others during routine expeditions. At first they offered concern, but as her condition worsened, concern turned into disgust, then fear. The Zevran people were known for their strength and resilience. Illness was a sign of weakness, and weakness had no place in their society. When they finally decided to abandon her, they did so with cold efficiency. There were no tears, no goodbyes, only the silent acknowledgement that she was no longer one of them. Her family, her friends, even the elders who had once praised her, simply turned their backs and left. They told her she was being left behind for her own good, that it was better this way. But Alira knew the truth. She had been abandoned because she was no longer useful. She was a burden. As she lay there, her vision blurred, Lyra wondered if this was truly the end. Would she die here alone and forgotten? Was this how her story would end? Far above, high in orbit around Zyra, a lone human ship drifted through space. Its pilot, Jack Drayton, had been surveying the planet for potential resources. He wasn't part of any major faction or government. Jack was an independent explorer, always seeking the unknown. He had spent most of his life on the fringes of space, far from the core worlds, where politics and bureaucracy reigned. Out here in the vast expanse of the frontier, he was free. Jack's ship, the Wayfarer, was a small, nimble vessel, designed for long-range exploration and equipped with the latest scanning technology. As he sat at the helm, monitoring the planet's surface for any signs of valuable minerals or hidden resources, his sensors picked up something strange, a faint life sign deep in one of the planet's valleys. "That's odd," Jack muttered to himself, tapping the console to get a better reading. The life sign was weak, almost imperceptible, but definitely sentient. His brow furrowed. There shouldn't be anyone down there. Zyra was supposed to be uninhabited, a desolate rock with nothing but ice and dust storms. He considered ignoring it. After all, it wasn't his job to investigate every strange signal he came across. But something gnawed at him, a sense of responsibility he couldn't quite shake. He'd seen too many people get left behind in his life, abandoned, forgotten, or worse. Jack had always made it a point to help when he could, even if it meant taking risks. With a sigh, he punched in the coordinates and engaged the ship's landing thrusters. The Wayfarer descended toward the surface, cutting through the planet's thick atmosphere with ease. As he approached the valley, the weak life sign grew stronger, but only slightly. Whoever it was, they were close to death. The Wayfarer touched down on the frozen ground with a soft thud. Jack suited up and grabbed his medkit just in case. As he stepped out of the ship, the freezing wind hit him like a wall, but his suit's thermal regulators kept the cold at bay. He followed the scanner's readings, trekking through the rough terrain until he finally saw her, Alira. At first, Jack thought he was too late. She looked like a lifeless, silver-skinned statue, her body curled up in a ball, barely moving. But as he got closer, he saw the faint rise and fall of her chest, the shallow breaths that meant she was still alive, just barely. "Holy hell," Jack whispered, kneeling beside her. He had seen many things in his travels, but never an alien like this. Her delicate, shimmering scales and otherworldly beauty were mesmerizing, even in her weakened state. But she was dying, and fast. Without wasting a second, Jack carefully lifted her into his arms. She was light, almost too light, as if the illness had drained all the strength from her body. He carried her back to the Wayfarer, where he laid her down on a makeshift bed in the ship's small medical bay. Jack hooked her up to the ship's diagnostic tools, letting the AI run a full scan of her condition. The results were grim. Whatever sickness had taken hold of her was unlike anything he had ever seen. Her organs were failing, and she was severely dehydrated. If he didn't act fast, she wouldn't make it through the night. As the ship's systems worked to stabilize her, Jack sat by her side, watching her fragile form with a mix of concern and determination. He didn't know who she was or where she came from, but he wasn't going to let her die. Not here, not like this. "Hang in there," he whispered, though he wasn't sure if she could hear him. "I'm going to save you." Chapter 2. A delicate recovery. Elira's body lay still in the small medical bay as the hum of the Wayfarer's systems filled the air. The ship's AI worked tirelessly, administering fluids, nutrients, and oxygen to stabilize her failing body. Jack paced the small room, feeling an unfamiliar sense of helplessness. He wasn't a doctor or a medic, but he had enough knowledge from his years in space to run the basic medical equipment on board. That would have to be enough for now. The night passed in tense silence. Jack stayed awake, occasionally checking the vitals displayed on the screen. They were improving, but only slightly. Her Zevran biology was complicated, and the ship's systems struggled to understand her physiology. Still, she was alive. For now, that was enough. In the early hours of the next day, Elira stirred. Her eyelids fluttered, and a soft groan escaped her lips. Jack, who had been dozing lightly in a chair nearby, immediately jolted awake. "Elira?" Jack asked gently, unsure if she could understand him. He didn't know her name yet, but the Zevran language was in the ship's database, so he repeated the question in their tongue. "Can you hear me?" Her eyes slowly opened, revealing her violet irises, dull but focused on him. Confusion was etched on her face, as if she were trying to make sense of her surroundings. Her throat was dry, and she tried to speak, but only a faint whisper escaped. "Easy," Jack said softly, pouring a small cup of water from a nearby dispenser. He held it to her lips, letting her sip slowly. She winced at first, but managed to drink. "You're safe now. I found you out there alone." Elira's breathing became steadier, and after a few moments she managed to whisper, Who are you?" "My name's Jack Drayton," he said, giving her a small, reassuring smile. "I'm a human. I found you abandoned on this planet. You were in pretty bad shape, but you're going to be okay." Elira blinked, processing his words, abandoned. The word echoed in her mind, the memory of her people leaving her behind still fresh and painful. She closed her eyes, trying to hold back the tears. Her people had forsaken her, and yet here was this stranger, this human, who had risked his life to save her. "Why?" she asked, her voice trembling with a mix of gratitude and confusion. "Why did you help me?" Jack sat back in his chair, running a hand through his short-cropped hair. "I've seen a lot of people get left behind in my life," he said, his tone more serious now. "I wasn't going to let that happen to you. Not when I could do something about it." Elira's heart ached, but for the first time in what felt like forever, it wasn't from the illness. It was from something deeper, something she hadn't felt since her people abandoned her. Hope. Jack's words resonated with her, stirring a feeling she thought was long gone. She didn't know this human, but he had saved her when no one else had cared to. For a long moment, Elira just lay there, gazing at Jack. She tried to make sense of what had happened, but the exhaustion of her recovery pulled her back into sleep. Jack didn't leave her side, continuing to monitor her vitals and make sure she stayed stable. Over the next few days, Elira's strength began to return. Jack provided her with nourishment and hydration, and as the healing processes in her body started to work again, Her silver scales slowly regained their subtle glow. She was still weak, but the worst seemed to be over. As they spent more time together, Jack explained what had happened, how he had found her and brought her to his ship. Elira listened intently, still struggling to understand why a human, a stranger, would go out of his way to save her when her own people had left her for dead. Your people? They just abandoned you? Jack asked one evening, unable to hide his disbelief. Elira nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. In Zevran culture, weakness is a burden. I became sick, and they didn't want to take responsibility. They didn't want me slowing them down. Her voice cracked slightly, and she looked away. It's the way things are, Jack frowned. That's not right. No one deserves to be left behind like that, no matter the circumstances. Elira met his eyes, surprised by the conviction in his voice. You humans are strange, she said softly. You act with compassion, even when there's nothing to gain. Jack chuckled. Yeah, I guess that's one way to put it. But honestly, it's just what anyone should do. Life's hard enough out here without people abandoning each other. The more they spoke, the more Elira realized how different humans were from the Zevrans. Where her people valued strength and survival above all else, Jack showed kindness and empathy, qualities she hadn't seen in a long time. Slowly her heart began to open to the idea that maybe not all beings in the galaxy were as cold and indifferent as her own race. Chapter 3. A growing bond. Elira's recovery was progressing rapidly under Jack's care, and the days aboard the Wayfarer began to form a quiet routine. Every morning, Elira would wake to the soft hum of the ship's engines as Jack charted his course to various parts of the galaxy, exploring asteroids, barren moons, and distant planets. The more time they spent together, the more they came to understand each other in ways that neither had anticipated. It had been almost 3 weeks since Jack found Elira on that barren planet, and though her physical recovery was nearly complete, there were still emotional wounds that remained. She had been left behind by her people, a cold rejection that haunted her thoughts every night. The loneliness that had settled into her heart wasn't easily mended. Jack, in his own way, seemed to sense this, though he rarely spoke of it. Instead, he showed her kindness, offering her small gestures of companionship that slowly chipped away at the coldness surrounding her heart. On one particular evening, Jack prepared dinner in the ship's small kitchen. The Wayfarer wasn't much, but it had everything Jack needed to keep himself, and now Elira, comfortable during his long journeys through the stars. Elira had been fascinated by the concept of cooking, something entirely foreign to her. The Zevrans consumed synthetic nutrient blocks designed to maximize efficiency, but humans found joy in preparing food, taking time to make meals into experiences. Jack set 2 plates of food on the small table in the common area. It was simple roasted vegetables and a protein substitute that he had managed to salvage from one of his earlier trips to a galactic outpost. Elira watched as he arranged everything carefully, the smell of the food unfamiliar but oddly enticing. You don't have to go through all this trouble, Elira said quietly, her voice still carrying a hint of hesitation. Jack shook his head, smiling as he sat down across from her. It's no trouble. Besides, it's nice to share a meal with someone for a change. Space can be lonely even for someone used to it. Elira picked up her fork, mimicking Jack's movements as she carefully took a bite of the food. Her eyes widened in surprise at the taste, the flavors foreign but pleasant. It's good, she said, her voice filled with genuine surprise. Jack laughed softly, pleased with her reaction. Glad you like it. I've had to learn to cook for myself out here. No one else is around to do it, so it's either learn or starve. They ate in silence for a while, the sound of the ship's engines a constant background hum. Elira found herself relaxing more and more around Jack. His presence was calming in a way that surprised her. Back among her own people there was always pressure to be strong, to excel, to never show weakness. But here with Jack there was no such expectation. He didn't care about her strength or her status. He cared about her well-being, something she wasn't used to. After dinner they sat together in the small common area, a space lined with shelves filled with Jack's collection of relics and mementos from his journeys across the stars. Elira had taken a particular interest in one of the objects on the shelf, a small, intricately carved wooden box. She had asked Jack about it once, and he explained that it had belonged to his grandmother, a reminder of his life back on Earth before he became a wanderer. As they sat, Elira finally found the courage to ask the question that had been weighing on her mind. Jack, why do you live out here in the far reaches of space? You could have stayed on Earth, lived among your people. Why choose this life? Jack leaned back in his chair, gazing out of the viewport at the vastness of space beyond. He seemed to consider her question carefully before answering. Earth's a beautiful place, he said softly, but it never felt like home to me. I don't really fit in there. Too many rules, too many expectations. Out here it's different. I can be myself. I can explore, discover things no one else has ever seen. It's freeing. Elira nodded, understanding his words more than he might have realized. In a way, they were alike. Both of them had been cast out, Jack by choice and Elira by circumstance. They were two wanderers, searching for something they hadn't quite found yet. Do you ever get lonely? She asked, her voice quieter now, as if she were afraid of the answer. Jack glanced at her, a hint of sadness in his eyes. Yeah, sometimes, he admitted, but I'm used to it. Out here, you learn to live with the silence. Elira looked away, feeling a pang of guilt. She hadn't considered that Jack might be just as lonely as she had been. She had been so focused on her own abandonment that she hadn't thought to ask him about his own life, his own struggles. I don't think I've ever met someone like you, she said after a long pause. Humans? You're different from anyone I've known. My people would never have done what you did for me. They would have left you behind, just like they left me. Jack frowned, leaning forward slightly. Elira, what they did to you, that wasn't right. I don't care what their culture says. No one deserves to be left behind like that. Elira's eyes shimmered with emotion. She had spent so long trying to convince herself that her abandonment was justified, that her illness had made her unworthy of her people's care. But hearing Jack's words, spoken with such sincerity, made her question everything she had been taught. You don't know what it's like, she whispered, her voice trembling. To be cast out, to be told you're not worth saving. Jack reached across the table, gently placing his hand over hers. His touch was warm, grounding her in the present moment. You're worth it, he said softly. To me, you're worth everything. Elira looked up, meeting his gaze. There was something in his eyes that made her heart race, something she hadn't felt in a long time. It wasn't just compassion, it was deeper than that. For the first time since her abandonment, she felt truly seen, not as a weak Zevran, not as a burden, but as someone who mattered. The silence between them was heavy with unspoken emotion. Elira's hand remained under Jack's, and she didn't pull away. For the first time in what felt like forever, she wasn't alone. The next few weeks passed in much the same way, with Elira and Jack growing closer as they traveled through the uncharted regions of space. Jack took her to planets she had never seen before, introducing her to the wonders of the galaxy that she had only ever dreamed about. One day, while they were exploring a small moon orbiting a gas giant, Elira asked Jack to teach her how to fly the Wayfarer. Jack was hesitant at first, unsure if Elira was ready for such a responsibility, but she insisted. I've spent my whole life being told what I can't do, she said, her voice firm. I want to learn. I want to be able to take control of my own destiny. Jack couldn't argue with that. He had always admired Elira's resilience, and if flying the ship was something she wanted, then he would teach her. The lessons began that very afternoon. Jack walked her through the basics of navigation, explaining how the ship's systems worked and how to read the control panels. Elira was a quick learner, her sharp mind absorbing the information with ease. Soon she was guiding the Wayfarer through asteroid fields and tight spaces, her hands steady on the controls. As she piloted the ship, a sense of freedom washed over her. She had never felt so alive. The Zevrans had always told her that she was weak, that she would never amount to anything, but here she was, flying through the stars with the man who had saved her life. Jack watched her with a proud smile on his face. He had known from the moment he found her that Elira was special, but seeing her come into her own like this was more than he had ever expected. Chapter 4. A new beginning. Elira's recovery had come full circle. She was no longer the fragile, abandoned girl Jack had found on Zyra Huv. She had regained her strength, her confidence, and something more, her sense of self. And with that came a realization that had been building for weeks now. She couldn't deny the growing connection she felt with Jack, a bond that had started with gratitude, but had evolved into something much deeper. One evening, as the Wayfarer drifted through a quiet sector of space, Alira approached Jack. He was sitting in the cockpit, staring out at the stars as he often did when he needed to think. She stood beside him for a moment, watching him in silence before finally speaking. "Jack," she said softly, her voice steady despite the emotions swirling inside her, "there's something I need to tell you." Jack turned to her, his expression curious. "What?" Chapter 4. A new beginning. Alira's physical recovery was nearly complete, and the bond between her and Jack had grown into something undeniable. But as her strength returned, so did the memories of her abandonment. The realization that she was truly alone in the galaxy, without her people, without the life she had once known, still lingered in the corners of her mind. Yet there was something else growing inside her, a sense of hope. This hope had little to do with her physical survival, and everything to do with the human who had saved her. Over the past several weeks, Jack had shown her kindness and compassion she had never known before, not even among her own race. He had given her more than just medical care. He had given her companionship, understanding, and above all, choice. As she stood on the observation deck of the Wayfarer, looking out into the vast star-filled void, Alira's mind was consumed with thoughts of what lay ahead. There was no going back to the Zevrans. She was sure of that now, but the question that weighed heavily on her heart was, where did she belong? Jack had given her freedom and safety, but he had also given her something else she hadn't expected: love. At first it had been subtle, an unspoken feeling that grew between them as they shared stories and explored new worlds. But now it was unmistakable. Alira could feel it in the way Jack looked at her, in the way he gently guided her when teaching her to fly, and in the way he listened to her, valuing her opinions and thoughts in a way no one else ever had. But would Jack want her to stay with him forever? Did humans even think that way? Alira had learned so much about human customs, but love was something she hadn't fully grasped yet. Among the Zevrans, relationships were transactional, often arranged for political or social gain. Love, as humans understood it, was seen as an unnecessary indulgence. Still, the more time she spent with Jack, the more she began to understand why humans cherished it so much. Love, she realized, was not a weakness as the Zevrans believed. It was a strength. It was what had driven Jack to save her when her own people had abandoned her. It was what fueled his relentless desire to protect her, to teach her, to make sure she knew she was never alone again. And now, standing alone in the observation deck, Alira knew what she had to do. Later that evening, Alira found Jack sitting in the cockpit, staring out at the stars. The soft glow of the controls illuminated his face, giving him a look of quiet contemplation. It was a familiar sight. Jack often came here when he needed to think, when the vastness of space weighed heavy on his thoughts. She approached him slowly, her steps soft against the metal floor. Jack must have sensed her presence because he turned slightly, offering her a small smile. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked, his voice warm and familiar. Alira shook her head, sitting down in the co-pilot's chair next to him. She didn't respond immediately, letting the silence between them stretch on as she gathered her thoughts. She had rehearsed this conversation in her mind countless times, but now that the moment was here, the words seemed harder to form. "Jack," she began, her voice quieter than she intended, "there's something I need to talk to you about." He turned fully toward her, his expression immediately serious. "What's on your mind?" Alira took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. "I've been thinking a lot about what comes next," she said slowly, choosing her words carefully. "About where I fit in now. I can't go back to the Zevrans. That much is clear, but I don't know if I can stay here with you either." Jack's brow furrowed, concern flashing in his eyes. "Why not?" he asked softly, his voice tinged with confusion. "You're welcome here, Alira. You know that. I don't want you to leave." Alira's heart raced at his words, but she kept gaze on the stars outside the window, afraid to meet his eyes. I don't want to leave either, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. But I don't know what you want from me. I don't know if I'm just someone you saved out of pity or if pity. Jack interrupted, his tone firm but gentle. Illyra, I didn't save you because I pitied you. I saved you because... He paused, his gaze softening as he searched for the right words. Because you deserve to live. You deserve more than what your people gave you. And because he stopped, the weight of his next words hanging in the air. Illyra finally turned to look at him, her violet eyes searching his face for some hint of what he was trying to say. Jack took a deep breath. Illyra, I care about you, more than I've ever cared about anyone else. You're not just someone I saved. You're everything to me. Illyra's heart skipped a beat, and for a moment she was too stunned to respond. She had hoped, perhaps even dreamed, that Jack might feel the same way she did. But hearing him say it out loud made it real in a way that left her breathless. I care about you too, Jack, she said softly, her voice trembling slightly. But I'm afraid that this, whatever this is between us, won't last. Humans and Zevrans aren't meant to be together. We're different. Jack leaned closer, his eyes locking onto hers. I don't care about that. I don't care about what your people say or what anyone else thinks. All I know is that I don't want to lose you. Not now, not ever. Illyra's breath caught in her throat as Jack's words washed over her. She could feel the sincerity in his voice, the depth of his feelings for her, and in that moment, all the fear and uncertainty that had been holding her back melted away. She reached out, her hand gently resting on Jack's. I don't want to lose you either, she whispered, her heart racing in her chest. But if I stay with you, I want it to be more than just as someone you saved. I want to be with you, Jack, truly. Jack's eyes softened, a smile tugging at the corners of his lips. Then stay, he said, his voice filled with quiet conviction. Stay with me, not because I saved you, but because we belong together. Illyra's heart swelled with emotion, and for the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to fully embrace what she had been feeling all along. She leaned forward, closing the distance between them, and gently pressed her lips to his. The kiss was soft, tentative at first, but it quickly deepened as the emotions they had both been holding back came rushing to the surface. It was a kiss that spoke of everything they had been through together, their fears, their hopes, and the undeniable connection that had grown between them. When they finally pulled away, Jack rested his forehead against hers, his breath warm against her skin. You're not alone anymore, Illyra, he whispered. And you never will be, Illyra smiled, tears pricking at the corners of her eyes. For the first time in her life, she felt truly safe, truly loved. And in that moment, she knew that her place wasn't with the Zevrans or any other race. Her place was here with Jack. In the days that followed, Illyra and Jack settled into their new life together aboard the Wayfarer. It was a life filled with adventure, exploration, and most of all, love. They traveled to distant worlds, discovering new planets and uncovering ancient secrets. But no matter where they went, they always returned to each other. Their bond only grew stronger with time, a testament to the power of love and the resilience of two souls who had once been lost, but had now found their way to each other. One evening, as they sat together under the stars on a quiet, uninhabited planet, Jack turned to Illyra with a mischievous glint in his eye. You know, he said, a playful smile tugging at his lips. We should make this official. Illyra raised an eyebrow, intrigued. What do you mean? Jack grinned, reaching into his pocket and pulling out a small, intricately carved ring made of shimmering metal. Marry me, he said simply, his voice filled with warmth and certainty. Illyra stared at the ring in stunned silence, her heart racing. She had never considered marriage, at least, not in the way humans did. But looking at Jack, seeing the love in his eyes, she realized that this was exactly what she wanted. With a smile, she nodded. Yes, she whispered, her voice filled with emotion. I'll marry you. Jack slipped the ring onto her finger, and as they kissed under the starlit sky, Illyra knew that this was the beginning of a new chapter in their lives, one filled with love, adventure, and a future they would build together. For the first time in her life, Illyra knew where she belonged.